So, everyone, this is my media systems analysis of Qatar. My name is Robert Russo, and let's get into it. For the introduction of this country, it's a small but influential one in the Gulf Sea, right below Iran. It's a constitutional monarchy of fewer than 400,000 actual citizens and a population of just under 3 million. But it punches way above its weight when it comes to the media side of things. And that's exactly why it's so interesting for something like this. The ruling Al Thani family controls basically everything in Qatar, including the media. But the thing that makes Qatar unique is that the government runs one of the most restrictive domestic media environments within the Middle Eastern region, but it also funds Al Jazeera, which is one of the most watched and respected networks in the region and globally for topics around Middle East and North Africa. That level of contradiction is what this analysis is about. How does that happen? Why does it happen? What does it tell us about the relationship between a nation, its strategy, the media? So to do that, you have to look through its history and how this divide came to be and why it is the case. So we'll start on the historical side of things for a bit more context. You have to go back to the beginning here in the 1970s. It was very straightforward. The government controlled everything. They controlled television, radios, newspapers. The Ministry of Information had direct oversight, and the press was basically expected to support the state at all costs. In 1972, the ministry said that journalists should balance their aspirations to freedom with their obligations to society. That's a quote, which really just means don't do anything stupid. Do not criticize the emir. Do not criticize the religion of the nation, and stay out of our way, and you'll be good to go. Then in 1979, the Press and Publications Law locked a lot of this stuff in legally. It criminalized defamation and content deemed offensive to public morals. So a lot of the stuff that was talked about earlier in the decade now rigidly in place. That law is actually still in effect to this day. The terms of it are a bit vague, and so they've been able to kind of keep it in place over a long period of time. A big turning point came in 1995 when Sheikh Ahmad took over. Almost immediately, he pulled censors out of the newspapers, and the following year, he abolished the Ministry of Information, which was unheard of in the Arab world at the time. And then in that same year, 1996, or just the year after, Al Jazeera launched as the Middle East's first 24-hour satellite news channel, kind of in the same way that CNN is for us in the Western world. You move forward to 2004, and Qatar revising gets a new constitution that guarantees press freedom, but it's under the exception that it's in accordance with the law. And that law is still pretty restrictive, of course, as we saw back from the 1970s, that's still in place. So a lot of that stuff that you couldn't do then, you still can't do now. You can't criticize the emir. You can't go against the government really in much of any way if you're trying to release content to the public in Qatar. Then from 2014 onwards, we see the cybercrime law come into place. And then over time, it progressively tightens the controls on the digital side of things within the country. In 2020, there was an amendment, and in 2025, and each time it gets tighter, the restrictions get larger and more difficult to overcome. And we'll see more of that on the next slide, where we look through these legal frameworks that are in place. So we start at that 1979 press law. You go through Article 46, which criminalized the criticism of the emir without permission, which obviously he's never going to give permission, set prison term limits for libel and content offensive to public morals. So you start to see here that a lot of it's very vague, a lot of gray area there, which gives the decision up to the government on what they can and cannot take down or criminalize. In 2004, as we mentioned with the rise of the new constitution, the new code in there is that defamation is punishable by up to 2 years in prison, and insulting Islam carries criminal penalties with it. And then we move forward into that 2014 cybercrime law, where false news, again, a very vague term, threatening state security is up to 3 years with $500,000 in Qatari money as a fine. And then in 2020, that law was amended where false news is raised up to 5 years in imprisonment. And then in 2025, you start to see another big one here. Law 11 is another addition to this law from 2014. Unauthorized image or video publication up to a year and $100,000 fine in Qatari money. And that really means that if you are shooting a live shot or if you are taking a picture for photojournalists and not every single person in that picture gives you permission, then the government can take it down, which really puts a strain on photojournalism and broadcast journalism within the country. We move into some of the media ownership side of things where you could start to see how much of a role the Qatari government has in what is displayed to its people. So on the print side of things, a bit of a declining market for them there. It's all major papers are owned by the ruling family and the members of the business elite. Al Watan and Al Sharq are in Arabic, and the Peninsula and Gulf Times are in English. All four of which are owned by the Qatari government or business elites with a lot of pull within the country. More self-censorship than in broadcast on domestic politics. And moving into the broadcast side of things, we have the Qatar Media Corporation, who's in charge of basically everything on the broadcast end within the country. It's state-owned and 75% government funded, just about. It's chaired by the uh, chairman of the board of Al Jazeera, who is a member of the Al Thani family. So you start to see some of those conflicts of interests between Al Jazeera and state-owned media, and that's how that split kind of becomes a bit of a blurred line. No private radio stations in Qatar, all under the QBS, which is under the QMC. It avoids criticism of the government, Islam, or ruling institutions. Those ones are both very much locked down and controlled. And then on the digital side of things, it gets a lot more difficult to do that in the digital world. So what they've done to get around that is they have Urdu, I believe I'm saying that right. It's a internet service provider, and it's the only one that you can use to get internet within the country. It's fully state owned. They control all of the infrastructure around it, and that means that they can surveil basically everything that you're doing on it. So, for example, Doha News, which is not controlled by the Qatari government, um, is also based in the country, and it also went under some major scrutiny. It actually got banned for quite some time, and the Media City in Qatar, Media City Qatar (MCQ) is the hub to attract international firms within the country, which was brought in around the time of the World Cup. We saw Bloomberg Partners join in at that time, monitored by the Qatar General Broadcasting Corporation. So on the digital side of things, they're locked up, but they're trying to bring more people into the fold, trying to increase their economic viability. In the digital media surveillance space, kind of continuing on with Ooredoo, it's the single ISP model. All the traffic flows through one government visible point. Proxy servers block political, pornographic, and immoral content. Again, what that means is often up for debate. And then video on IP is partially restricted. So that includes things like FaceTime, WhatsApp, places where people can communicate, especially with people outside of the country. Those are restricted, so you can't, not a lot comes in or out to people that are within the country's borders. And then the Qatar General Broadcasting Corporation monitors social media. And we see some of that, as I mentioned before, the Doha News incident. It was blocked back in 2016 to 2020 following critical coverage of the government. It was reinstated, but everyone behind it had to be replaced for it to get back up and running. Malcolm Badali in 2021, he was a Malaysian blogger. He was disappeared by the government for some time. He was charged under the cybercrime law from 2014 for migrant rights reporting, because that's a big issue in Qatar right now, and for quite some time has been their treatment of all of these migrants and the ones that are working. Again, only 400,000 of 3 million people are actually citizens within the country. So he was released after paying a substantial fine, shutting up and leaving the country. And that's how he got out of that. And for a Dutch journalist, which was most recently in the World Cup, which was held in Qatar in 2022, we'll get more into that a little bit It was stopped. He was stopped by police outside of the World Cup stadium, and he was recording footage of migrant workers who were serving as security for the event, forced to delete all of that stuff if he wanted to continue on. That was an accredited international journalist who they were locking down on that front when he entered the country. For Al Jazeera and Qatar's dual identity. This is where things start to get interesting for me, and I was really surprised to learn a lot of this stuff. So it was founded in 1996, as we've established, by Sheikh Ahmad, one of the leaders of the Al Thani family who took over around that time. It was designed as a soft power instrument to project influence. So really what that means is that Qatar, as a small country with a small population, doesn't really have the size for a military or political budget that can influence or push around a lot of its larger neighbors like Saudi Arabia, Iran, etc. So how do you control and how do you create power for yourself? Well, they did it by creating a massive media arm in Al Jazeera and funding that and keeping that up and running. And to this day, 430 million households around the world are involved with Al Jazeera, or they get information from Al Jazeera. And they broadcast in all different languages: English, Arabic, Turkish, more than that. But it's interesting because there is a big split, there's a divide between the two. On the English side of things, and what we see often in America when you hear something came out of an Al Jazeera journalist, it's often progressive. It's focused on human rights. A lot of them are very critical of Western governments. It's credible international reporting, though, and it's still taken very seriously. They've won major awards around the world, and it's targeting Western audiences specifically. It gives a different perspective on things for sure. And it sets global news agendas on Qatar and a lot of the stuff that's happening around the Middle East, North African region because it's local, right? It's there, it's being written there. And especially the Gulf region. And it's occasionally reported on workers' conditions in Qatar, but it's still kind of a touchy subject for them. And that's where you start to see that 75% of their funding comes from the Qatari government. Whereas on the Arabic side of things, it's way more conservative. It's aligned with the policy of the government. It supports the emir. And migrant worker conditions, his personal dealings and his life and his family, women's rights, LGBTQ plus rights, those are all off limits. They do not talk about it on the Arabic side of Al Jazeera. And so it's this total double standard that they're playing, and it's interesting to really, break down as this is the largest media arm of the country, and this is how they generated so much of this quote unquote soft power, is because they've dominated in the Western market by providing coverage where they have criticized Western governments and been progressive and focused on human rights abuses within the region or even within other governments around the world. But then you look towards the actual press freedom within the country itself, and it starts to paint a bit of a different picture. Now, I will say, a lot of the research from the Reporters Without Borders, which is the RSF. It's steadily improved within recent years. It's climbed a lot of these lists as some of the as for the safest countries in the world for journalists. So it's jumped up from 119 a couple of years ago. Now it was up to 84th in 2024. It's reached the problematic stage or designation, which is up from difficult. So that's a start. It's above it on the chart. Um, but these improved rankings do not necessarily relate to general actual press freedom because it just measures formal conditions for press and it doesn't take into account a lot of the self-censorship that the country faces. So 89% of Qatar's population are non-citizens, and a lot of them can be threatened with the loss of their residency. People in Qatar are foreign workers. They have to self-censor themselves from speaking out on their own labor rights and abuses to protect their employment so they don't get deported from the country. Social media users face criminal penalties for politically sensitive posts. And again, that sensitive is up for interpretation. And the US State Department has come out and said a lot of this is really happening. Self-censorship was prevalent in the country, and it's sets a dangerous precedent because so many within Qatar are afraid to speak, where the Al Jazeera English side of things is very outspoken on other powers and other issues pertaining in other parts of the world where they're much more quiet on what's going on inside Qatari borders. So the 2022 FIFA World Cup, probably the best single case study for understanding how their strategy works, especially in the modern world. And you can see the split kind of right down the middle and how they've framed things, I guess. Qatar has been under international media scrutiny since they won the hosting bid for the 2022 World Cup. That was all the way back in 2010. That means they had to face 12 years worth of stories about migrant workers dying, labor abuses, corruption allegations between them and FIFA for how they got the bid in the first place, and the treatment of LGBTQ fans within their borders. So by the time the tournament actually started, Qatar had a massive PR nightmare basically on their hands. And how do they make this seem like an appealing place to come watch football and support this big international tournament played within their walls. So their response was that same kind of dual strategy that we saw everywhere else. We see it with Al Jazeera. Publicly, they invest heavily in their media relations. They got a lot of international PR firms involved to help them through, international press coming in, projecting kind of an image of what they want it to look like to the outside world, meaning it's forward thinking and modern and engaged in the global ecosystem. Media City Qatar, which opened back in 2019. We discussed that a little bit before. It was a huge part of this. It presented Doha as a regional media hub that you would want to come to and do business in and do business with the people there. And it worked, right? Bloomberg Media, multi-year partnership with the Qatar Economic Forum. There was an internal partnership with the Qatar Financial Center to again get more people involved. And then affiliated networks with Media City Qatar includes Al Jazeera. So it's reaching hundreds of millions of homes around the world. The Oxford Business Group noted that the World Cup coverage contributed to Qatar's improved press freedom rankings in the following years. So a lot of maybe the bump that you see past 2022 can be related to some of the positive notions that were given to the press during the press run of the Qatar 2022 World Cup. But behind the scenes, the restrictions really didn't change that much within the country. The Dutch journalist we talked about stopped outside of the stadium. He was forced to delete the footage of the migrant workers. That happened during the World Cup. And every single visitor was required to download Haya, which was an app to access all of their tickets, get into their stadium, get around the country. And that app has been widely documented by a bunch of different groups as a surveillance tool by the Qatari government, which collected data on people's movements and their communications and their speaking on the government. So the World Cup is a clear illustration of Qatar's whole media approach, internationally open and domestically very closed, running at the same time. The PR works precisely because people see the openness and they don't see the control that's happening behind it, especially the average everyday viewer. So now for some of the applied theories that we've covered over the course of this summer semester, the authoritarian press theory, which we've spoken about, is it exists to serve the state. The media that they have within the state serves the state. The broadcast media all under state control, the print media all under state control, and even the digital media is under one internet service provider that's basically controlling what comes in and what comes out to those inside the country's walls. Internationally, the best lens for this is soft power, which we see over the course of or what we see with Al Jazeera and how they are able to flex the muscle of Qatar as a global power despite not having the physical military to support that. From a cultural imperialism standpoint and electronic colonialism, Al Jazeera is interesting because it cuts both ways. It's state funded, but it's actively challenging the dominance of Western media like CNN, NBC, BBC in the Arab world. It gives audiences an Arabic language perspective, pushing back against the Western framing of how they're presented in the Western world, and it gives that to the Middle East, North African region. Um, Even brings the Middle Eastern perspective to Western readers, so kind of the opposite of that as well, rather than leaving them dependent on Western outlets reporting from the outside. You get that inside perspective as well to try and push back against cultural imperialism. The propaganda model is a big part of this as well. We know that the ownership filter is there between the QMC and Al Jazeera are both controlled or funded by the ruling family, and then we get that filter. The flak filter operates through legal prosecution rather than criticism because we know 5+ years in prison for certain offenses can definitely deter, and a lot of heavy fines can definitely deter people from saying things wrong, and that promotes a lot of people saying things that are right, or not necessarily right, but pro Qatari government. And fourth here, the agenda setting and framing. So Al Jazeera's Arab Spring and Gaza coverage were incredibly important. They set regional agendas around a lot of what's happening in the region as it's discussed outside of the region. It defines interpretive frames for millions of viewers. We know this 400+ million global viewers of Al Jazeera. And both in English and in Arabic, it sets regional global news agendas. So the conclusion here is that the domestically, we see, or just overall, we see a split between the domestic policy or the domestic media system and the global media system within the country. Qatar's media system, it runs on two tracks. It's authoritarian control designed to protect the Al Thani family and the Islamic framework of their society. There's no criticism of the emir allowed, no labor rights coverage allowed, no dissent allowed. Internationally, it's a machine of soft power and pushing the influence of Qatar as a media hub beyond the size of the small country. It enhances international prestige and diplomacy and shapes regional and global news agendas. So it's very important that Al Jazeera, as its leading arm, is incredibly important on the global stage to kind of keep this facade up. And Al Jazeera, again, doing a lot of really strong independent journalism on global governments, but turned inwards, they're not seeing that same action against the Qatari government. The direction of travel is worth paying attention to. Despite improving press freedom rankings, the 2025 cybercrime law that just got passed is the most aggressive legal restriction on journalists in years that's passed. The international community is warned that it could be used to prosecute journalists for doing their jobs, like these photojournalists, these broadcast journalists. So while the rankings go up, the legal toolkit for suppressing journalism in the country has actually expanded, not shrunken. There are two bigger lessons here worth taking away. I think one of them is that you can't understand a media system without understanding the structure that it's inside. So, as a constitutional monarchy, but a place that is authoritarian under the heavy control of the royal family, that is why Qatar operates in this way. And because they don't have a large population, they don't have a large government to really push their influence on others, this is why they've invested so heavily in their media arm. Second, press freedom rankings are a starting point, but they're not necessarily an answer because we see that um, not going out there and putting your opinions out does not get reflected on more objective rankings lists, self-censors in the classroom, or the migrant worker who won't post on social media because their visa depends on them staying quiet for work. So context and legal knowledge matter as much as what we're seeing put out by some of these institutions and indexes. Overall, Qatar is going to keep investing in global media presence while tightening things at home as years follow by if these recent trends are to be followed, which means that this split between domestic and global isn't going anywhere, and that makes it one of the most interesting things to follow, not just in the Middle East and North Africa, but across the world.